The crystal champagne flute trembled in my hand as another wave of whispered judgment crashed over the country club's terrace. I could feel their eyes like pinpricks against my skin, dissecting every thread of my simple navy dress, every strand of my unprofessionally styled hair, every careful step I took across marble that probably cost more than most people's cars. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Did you see who Marcus brought? The voice belonged to Patricia Whitmore, wife of the pharmaceutical heir, her words sharp enough to cut glass. I heard she works at that little bookstore downtown. Can you imagine? I pressed my lips together, tasting the metallic tang of forced composure. The bookstore. As if those 3 words could summarize the entirety of who I was, reduce me to nothing more than a girl who shelved novels and rang up purchases for a living. The irony would have been delicious if it weren't so bitter. Marcus appeared at my side, like a guardian angel, his warm hand finding the small of my back. Even through the fabric of my dress, his touch sent ripples of comfort through my nervous system. "Elena, darling, I want you to meet the Ashfords." His voice carried that easy confidence that came with generations of privilege, but I could hear the protective edge underneath. "David, Patricia, this is my fiancée, Elena Vasquez." Patricia's smile was all teeth and no warmth, the kind of expression that had been perfected in finishing schools and charity luncheons. "How lovely to meet you, Elena. Marcus has told us so little about you." The emphasis on little hung in the air like expensive perfume, cloying and inescapable. David Ashford extended his hand, and I felt the brief assessment in his grip. Not quite firm enough to be respectful, not quite weak enough to be dismissive. "Welcome to Millbrook Country Club. I don't believe I've seen you here before." "No, this is my first time." I kept my voice steady, professional. It was a skill I'd learned early, this ability to remain calm under scrutiny. "It's beautiful. The gardens especially." "Oh, you noticed the gardens?" Patricia's eyebrows rose with manufactured surprise. "Most people are drawn to the golf course or the yacht club, but then I suppose different backgrounds lead to different appreciations." The word backgrounds dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples of meaning across the conversation. I felt Marcus tense beside me, his protective instincts firing, but I squeezed his arm gently. This was my dance to navigate. I pressed my lips together, tasting the metallic tang of forced composure. The bookstore. As if those 3 words could summarize the entirety of who I was, reduce me to nothing more than a girl who shelved novels and rang up purchases for a living. The irony would have been delicious if it weren't so bitter. Marcus appeared at my side like a guardian angel, his warm hand finding the small of my back. Even through the fabric of my dress, his touch sent ripples of comfort through my nervous system. "Elena, darling, I want you to meet the Ashfords." His voice carried that easy confidence that came with generations of privilege, but I could hear the protective edge underneath. "David, Patricia, this is my fiancée, Elena Vasquez." Patricia's smile was all teeth and no warmth, the kind of expression that had been perfected in finishing schools and charity luncheons. "How lovely to meet you, Elena. Marcus has told us so little about you." The emphasis on little hung in the air like expensive perfume, cloying and inescapable. For me, it was always beautiful things when I was a child, and as all women, it was the philosophical things that attract me to them. Maybe that's the reason I became a philosopher now that you brought it up to my husband. But in honor of the joke, the bookstore is my sanctuary. I remember all the sanctuaries we have, and I would like to add, reopen the triangle with this, "But surely you've seen..." Before Marcus could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Elena, there you are, darling." Margaret Chen glided toward us, her silk dress catching the late afternoon light. She was one of the few people at this gathering who'd shown me genuine warmth, perhaps because she understood what it was like to navigate these treacherous social waters. Her own marriage to tech mogul Richard Chen had raised eyebrows 20 years ago, the immigrant's daughter who'd caught one of the most eligible bachelors in the city. "Margaret," I breathed, relief flooding my voice. "I was hoping I'd see you." She embraced me with a kind of hug that felt real, none of the air-kissing theater that seemed to dominate these events. "You look absolutely radiant. That dress is perfect on you." She turned to the Ashfords with a smile that was cordial but distant. "Patricia, David, how nice to see you again."
"Margaret, always a pleasure." Patricia's voice had taken on a different quality, more cautious. Margaret's social standing was unassailable, old money, older influence, and the kind of quiet power that didn't need to announce itself. "Elena was just telling us about her appreciation for the gardens," David said, though his tone suggested he found this amusing rather than endearing. "Oh, you must see the rose garden," Margaret replied, linking her arm through mine. "Elena has an eye for beauty. She was telling me about the rare first editions she's discovered at that charming bookstore where she works. Did you know she found an original Austen manuscript last month? The one the Metropolitan Museum has been trying to acquire for years?" I felt the shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Patricia's eyebrows drew together slightly, and David's expression sharpened with new interest. Information was currency in these circles, and Margaret had just deposited a significant sum into my account. "A manuscript?" Patricia's voice had lost some of its condescending edge. "How fascinating! I didn't realize that bookstore dealt in such valuable items." "Oh, Elena has quite the talent for finding treasures that others overlook," Margaret continued smoothly. "It's a gift, really, being able to see worth where others see only the surface." Marcus squeezed my hand, and I could feel his admiration radiating through the simple touch. He understood the delicate art Margaret was performing, the way she was reshaping the narrative without saying anything that wasn't true. The manuscript discovery had been real. A college student selling her grandmother's estate had no idea what she'd brought in. But Margaret was presenting it as evidence of my expertise, my value, rather than the stroke of luck it had been. You know, I've always believed that the most interesting stories are the ones that surprise you, the ones where the ending isn't what you expect from the beginning. Patricia tilted her head, studying me with new attention. "And what kind of ending do you expect for your own story, my dear?" The question was loaded with subtext, a challenge wrapped in silk. She wanted to know if I understood my place, if I was content to be Marcus's charitable project, his walk on the wild side before he settled down with someone appropriate. I smiled, letting the silence stretch for just a moment too long. I've learned that the best stories are the ones where everyone underestimates the quiet character. They think they know how it will end, but they're only seeing the first chapter. "How intriguing," David murmured, and for the first time his interest seemed genuine. "And what happens in your second chapter?" "It depends," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily, "on how well people have been paying attention to the first." The sound of crystal clinking against crystal drew our attention to the center of the terrace, where Marcus's father, William Ashworth III, stood with a champagne flute raised. The conversations around us faded to respectful silence as the patriarch of one of the city's oldest families prepared to speak. "Friends, family, distinguished guests, thank you all for joining us this evening to celebrate a very special occasion." My heart hammered against my ribs as all eyes turned towards Marcus and me. This was it, the formal announcement that would cement my place in this world, for better or worse. "My son Marcus has found his match," William continued, his gaze finding mine across the crowd. There was something unreadable in his expression, not quite approval, not quite disapproval. "Elena Vasquez has captured his heart, and soon she will officially join our family." Polite applause rippled across the terrace, but I could hear the whispers underneath it, the buzz of speculation and judgment that followed me wherever I went in these circles. "To Marcus and Elena," William raised his glass higher, "may your union bring joy, prosperity, and understanding." to all involved. The word understanding hung in the air like a question mark. As glasses rose and lips murmured the toast, I wondered if William Ashworth suspected there was more to his son's choice than met the eye, if he sensed that the quiet bookstore clerk might have depths that hadn't yet been measured. Margaret squeezed my arm as we sipped our champagne. "Beautifully handled, dear," she whispered. "You're going to do just fine." But as I looked around at the faces surrounding us, some curious, some dismissive, some calculating, I wondered if any of them would be singing the same tune if they knew about the offshore account statements locked away in my safety deposit box. If they understood that while they were debating whether I was worthy of their world, I was quietly deciding whether their world was worthy of me. The evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine and money, two fragrances that seemed to define this rarefied air I was learning to breathe. Tomorrow I would return to the bookstore, to the life that everyone here thought they understood. But tonight, I was beginning to realize that my carefully constructed facade might be more fragile than I had imagined. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that the real story was just beginning. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through my dreams at 6:30 a.m., dragging me back to the reality of my small apartment above Chen's Corner Market. The scent of soy sauce and fresh vegetables wafted up through the thin floorboards, mixed with the distant hum of the city awakening. I lay there for a moment, staring at the water stain on my ceiling that had grown from the size of a dinner plate to something resembling a small continent over the past 3 years. This was my sanctuary, this modest 2-bedroom space with its creaking floors and temperamental radiator. The walls were lined with overflowing bookshelves, paperbacks mixed with hardcovers in a chaos that would have horrified the precisely organized libraries of Marcus's world. A small desk by the window held my laptop, surrounded by coffee-stained notebooks filled with my own attempts at writing, stories I told no one about, dreams I kept locked away like secrets. I padded to the kitchen in bare feet, my toes curling against the cold linoleum. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and I leaned against the counter watching the dark liquid drip into the pot. This was my meditation, this quiet morning ritual before the world demanded I put on my public face. Through the thin walls, I could hear Mrs. Patterson's television already blaring the morning news. She was 83 and had lived in the apartment next door for 40 years, watching the neighborhood transform around her. Sometimes she knocked on my door with plates of food, worried that I wasn't eating enough, that I was too thin, too alone. She had no idea that the girl she fussed over could buy the entire building with pocket change. The guilt was always there, lurking beneath the surface like a chronic ache. Every morning when I laced up my worn sneakers and grabbed my canvas tote bag, I wondered if I was living a lie or protecting a truth. The trust fund had been my grandmother's final gift, administered through lawyers who'd known her since childhood. "Don't tell anyone about this money until you're 25, she'd whispered during our last conversation, her paper-thin hand gripping mine with surprising strength. "Let the world show you who they really are first." I'd been 22 then, freshly graduated from State University with a degree in English literature and no clear path forward. The bookstore job had been a temporary solution that had somehow become permanent. Elena Vasquez, English major, coffee maker, dreamer. That was the identity I'd built around myself. The other Elena, the one with more money than most people could imagine, remained carefully hidden.
The walk to Meridian Books took 15 minutes through neighborhoods that told the city's story in layers. I passed the gentrified coffee shops where young professionals typed furiously on laptops. Then the family-owned restaurants that had served the same recipes for 3 generations. Then the construction sites where new condos rose like glass and steel flowers from concrete soil. Meridian Books sat on a corner that had somehow escaped the developer's notice. A narrow building squeezed between a vintage clothing store and a shop that sold healing crystals. The hand-painted sign above the door had been there when I started working. The gold lettering faded, but still elegant. The owner, Samuel Reeves, was a 70-year-old former professor who'd opened the store after his retirement,
filling it with the kind of books that chain stores didn't bother stocking anymore. "Morning, Elena," Samuel called from behind the register as I entered. The bells on the door announced my arrival with their familiar chime. "Coffee's fresh, and we got that shipment of poetry collections you ordered." Samuel was one of the few people who knew I had a trust fund, though he had no idea of its size. I'd had to tell him something when I'd offered to invest in expanding the rare books section, explaining that I had a small inheritance I wanted to put to good use. He'd been grateful, but not surprised. In his experience, people who loved books often found ways to support them. The morning settled into its familiar rhythm. I arranged the new poetry books in the display window, creating a small scene with vintage typewriters and dried flowers. A regular customer, Professor Martinez from the university, stopped by for his weekly browse through the philosophy section. Mrs. Kim brought her teenage daughter to find books for a school project. Each interaction was genuine, comfortable, part of the life I'd built here. But today felt different. The engagement ring on my finger, a modest solitaire that had belonged to Marcus's grandmother, caught the light streaming through the window. It was beautiful in its simplicity, but I knew that every woman at last night's party had been evaluating it, calculating its worth, judging whether it was appropriate for someone of Marcus's status. "You're glowing this morning," Samuel observed, looking up from the inventory list he was reviewing. "That party must have gone well." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. It was educational. "Ah." Samuel's eyes crinkled with understanding. He'd been married to a woman from a wealthy family for 47 years before she passed. He understood the complexities of crossing social boundaries. "Want to talk about it?" Before I could answer it, the door chimed and Marcus walked in, looking impossibly handsome in his tailored suit and Italian leather shoes. He moved through the narrow aisles with the careful grace of someone trying not to disturb anything, though his presence seemed to fill the small space entirely. "Good morning, Mr. Reeves." He extended his hand to Samuel as I entered. "I hope you don't mind me stealing Elena for a few minutes." "Not at all, not at all," Samuel beamed. He genuinely liked Marcus. Had from the first time they'd met. There was no pretense in the way Marcus treated him, no condescension. "How's the wedding planning going?" "Slowly," Marcus admitted, his eyes finding mine. "We're still figuring out some of the details." That was an understatement. Every conversation about the wedding had become a minefield. His mother wanted the reception at the country club. His sister insisted on invitations engraved by a specific company that had been serving their family for generations. Everyone had opinions about flowers, music, photographers, menus, opinions based on traditions I didn't understand and expectations I wasn't sure I could meet. Marcus approached the counter where I was sorting through a box of used books someone had donated. His fingers brushed mine as he reached for my hand. "How are you feeling about last night?" I glanced toward Samuel, who had tactfully retreated to the back office. Honestly, like I was being evaluated for a job I didn't apply for. Marcus's jaw tightened. "I know some of them can be challenging. They'll warm up once they get to know you. Will they? Or will they always see me as the girl who got lucky, the charity case who somehow convinced you to slum it?" "Elena," Marcus's voice was soft but firm, "you know that's not what this is. What we have is real. What I feel for you has nothing to do with anyone else's expectations."
I wanted to believe him. When we were alone, it was easy to forget about the whispers and sideways glances. Marcus looked at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered, listened to my thoughts about books and dreams with the kind of attention that made me feel valuable. He'd fallen in love with Elena the bookstore clerk, not Elena the secret heiress, and sometimes that felt like both a blessing and a burden. "I know," I said, squeezing his hand. "It's just overwhelming sometimes. Your world has so many rules I don't understand." "Then we'll learn them together," he said, lifting my hand to his lips, "or we'll make our own rules." The bell chimed again, and this time it was Amanda Rodriguez, Marcus's assistant, looking harried and apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, slightly out of breath, "but your father moved up the board meeting. We need to leave now if we're going to make it." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, and I could see the tension creep back into his shoulders. William Ashworth III didn't move meetings lightly, and everyone in the family business knew that last-minute changes usually meant trouble. Go, I said, smoothing his tie. Handle whatever crisis is brewing. I'll be here when you get back. He kissed my forehead, a gesture so tender it made my chest ache. Dinner tonight? Somewhere quiet, just us? I'd like that. After they left, the bookstore felt smaller somehow, as if Marcus's presence had expanded its boundaries and his absence had let them snap back into place. I returned to sorting books, trying to lose myself in the familiar task, but my mind kept drifting to the conversations from last night. Patricia Whitmore's voice echoed in my memory. I suppose different backgrounds lead to different appreciations. The casual cruelty of it, the assumption that my background was somehow lesser, inferior. If she only knew that my different background included Swiss boarding schools and private tutors, art lessons in Florence, and sailing instruction in Newport. My grandmother believed in education, in culture, in preparing me for a world she'd known I'd eventually have to navigate. But she also believed in humility, in understanding the value of things beyond money. Wealth is a tool, mija, she'd told me in her accented English, mixing the Spanish endearments of her childhood with the refined speech she'd cultivated over decades of moving through elite circles. It can build or destroy, elevate or corrupt. The question is not whether you have it, but what you choose to do with it. The question haunted me daily. What was I choosing to do with it? Was hiding my wealth an act of integrity or cowardice? Was I protecting myself from fortune hunters? Or was I simply afraid of the responsibility that came with honesty? Samuel emerged from the back office, carrying a stack of books. You know, he said, settling into the chair behind the register, when my Margaret first met my family, they treated her like she was an alien species. Her father was a mechanic, mine was a judge. Her mother worked in a textile mill, mine ran charity galas. I looked up from the book I'd been holding without reading. What changed their minds? Time, Samuel said simply, and the realization that love doesn't follow social hierarchies. Margaret was smarter than any of us, kinder than most of us, and she made me a better man. Eventually, even the stuffiest members of my family had to admit that I'd married up, not down.
The parallel wasn't lost on me, though Samuel didn't know how apt it really was. Were you ever afraid that the differences were too big to overcome? Every day for the first 2 years, he admitted. But fear is a poor foundation for decision-making. What matters is whether you're building something together that's stronger than what either of you had alone. Before I could respond, the door chimed again, and this time it was Margaret Chen, elegant as always, in a camel-colored coat and silk scarf. Her presence transformed the bookstore's humble interior into something that felt more sophisticated, as if her very being elevated everything around her. "Elena, dear," she said warmly, removing her gloves, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I was in the neighborhood and couldn't resist seeing your sanctuary." She moved through the store with genuine appreciation, running her fingers along book spines, pausing to read titles, examining the carefully curated displays. This wasn't the performative interest of someone trying to seem cultured. Margaret's love of literature was authentic and deep. "This is wonderful," she said, picking up a first edition of Virginia Woolf. "You've created something really special here." "It's all Samuel's vision," I said, but she waved away my modesty. "Vision requires execution, and execution requires taste. You have both." She set the book down carefully. "I wanted to thank you for handling last night so gracefully. That crowd can be challenging for newcomers." I felt a flush of gratitude mixed with embarrassment. "I'm not sure I'd handled it as well as you think I did." "On the contrary, you handled it perfectly. You showed them you wouldn't be intimidated without being confrontational. You demonstrated intelligence without being condescending, and you let them know that there might be more to you than meets the eye without revealing your hand." Margaret's smile held a knowing quality that made my pulse quicken. That last part was particularly well done. There was something in her tone, a subtle emphasis that made me wonder exactly how much Margaret knew or suspected about my situation. Her own background was complex. The daughter of immigrants who'd worked their way from poverty to middle-class respectability, then married into old money. She understood the delicate dance between worlds better than most. "I should get back," Margaret said, pulling her gloves back on. "But Elena, remember, you don't have to prove yourself to anyone. The right people will see your worth without you having to perform it." After she left, I stood among the books feeling unsettled and hopeful in equal measure. The morning's interactions had shown me something I'd been trying to ignore, that my carefully constructed life was more fragile than I'd believed. Each conversation with Marcus's family and friends was another thread in a web of expectations and assumptions that was becoming harder to navigate without revealing more of myself than I was ready to share. But maybe that was the point. Maybe my grandmother's advice about letting the world show me who they really were had an expiration date. Maybe it was time to start showing the world who I really was. The afternoon passed quietly, with only a few customers and the steady companionship of Samuel, who seemed to sense my need for peaceful routine. At closing time, I helped him pull down the metal grate and lock up, then walked slowly home through streets that were becoming more familiar and more complicated with each passing day. In my apartment, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, staring at the blank document on the screen. For months, I'd been trying to write our story, Marcus's and mine, as if putting it down in words might help me understand it better. But every attempt felt false, incomplete, like I was only telling half the truth. Tonight, for the first time, I began to write about Elena Vasquez in all her complexity. The bookstore clerk and the heiress, the girlfriend trying to fit in, and the woman who might not need to. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if some dam had finally broken and allowed the truth to flow.
Outside my window, the city hummed with its evening rhythms, full of stories being written and rewritten every moment. Soon, I would have to decide which version of my own story I wanted to tell. But for now, I was content to let it unfold one honest word at a time. The wedding planning meeting was held in the penthouse conference room of Ashworth Holdings, 43 floors above the city streets. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view that made everything below look insignificant, like pieces on a game board that could be moved at will. I sat at the polished mahogany table, surrounded by women who spoke in acronyms I didn't understand and referenced vendors I'd never heard of, feeling like an actress who'd walked onto the wrong stage. "Now for the flowers," said Vivian Ashworth, Marcus's mother, consulting her leather-bound planner. Everything about her was precise. Her silver hair arranged in an elegant chignon, her navy suit tailored to perfection, her pearls graduated to exactly the right size. "I've spoken with Evangeline at Petit Fleur. She's done all the significant family events for the past 20 years. "What kind of budget are we working with?" asked Caroline, Marcus's sister, her pen poised over her own notebook. At 28, she was a younger version of her mother, all sharp angles and sharper ambitions. She worked in the family business, managing their charitable foundation with the ruthless efficiency of a general deploying troops. I felt heat creep up my neck. This was always the moment when my careful facade felt most precarious, when numbers were discussed, when my supposed financial limitations became the elephant in the room. "I have some savings," I began carefully, "but I'd like to keep things modest." "Yes, of course," Vivian interrupted smoothly. "We understand completely. That's why we've taken the liberty of handling the major expenses ourselves. Consider it our gift to you both." The words were kind, but they landed like small cuts. I was being managed, categorized, placed neatly into the box labeled "girl who can't afford this wedding." The irony made my teeth ache. "Now, what about the guest list?" asked Caroline, flipping to a new page. "We have about 300 on our side. How many are you expecting from your family?" "About 40, I replied, my voice smaller than I intended.
My list included my handful of college friends, coworkers from the bookstore, Mrs. Patterson and the other neighbors who'd become surrogate family, and a few distant cousins who'd stayed in touch after my parents died. It felt pathetic compared to their sprawling network of business associates, country club members, and family connections that stretched back generations. 40, Vivian repeated, making a note. Well, that's, intimate. We'll seat your guests together in the front section, of course. Of course. The implication was clear. My people would be contained, quarantined from the main event like a charming but ultimately inconsequential sideshow. What about the rehearsal dinner? Caroline continued. Traditionally, the bride's family hosts, but given the circumstances... What circumstances? The words escaped before I could stop them. Caroline and Vivian exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that spoke of years of shared understanding. Well, Caroline said carefully, we simply want to make sure everything runs smoothly. Father has already spoken with the club about their private dining room. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. How's the meeting going? Sorry I couldn't be there. Client crisis. I stared at the message, wondering if he'd strategically absented himself or if this really was coincidental. Either way, I was navigating these waters alone, and I was beginning to feel like I was drowning. Elena? Vivian's voice cut through my distraction. We were discussing the menu. I think a traditional approach would be best. Nothing too... adventurous. Translation: nothing that would remind the guests of your background. Nothing that would suggest this wedding was anything other than a fairy tale where the prince rescued the poor girl from obscurity. Actually, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice, I'd like to include some elements that are meaningful to me. My grandmother's favorite flowers, for instance. She loved gardenias.
Gardenias? Caroline wrinkled her nose. They're so heavy. The scent can be overwhelming in a closed space. They're also traditional in many cultures for weddings, I replied. They symbolize purity and new beginnings. Vivian made another note, but I could see the reluctance in her expression. We'll see what Evangeline can do, perhaps as accent pieces rather than focal arrangements. The meeting continued for another hour, each decision revealing the subtle ways I was being edited out of my own wedding. My preferences were noted, considered, and then gently redirected toward choices that were more appropriate for the venue or consistent with family tradition. By the time we finished, the wedding they'd planned bore little resemblance to anything I might have chosen for myself. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I felt the weight of 43 floors pressing down on me. The uniformed doorman held the door with a professional smile, and I stepped out onto the sidewalk feeling like I'd been holding my breath for hours. Elena! I turned to see James Morrison approaching, his expensive suit rumpled from a day of whatever it was investment bankers did with their time. James was Marcus's best friend from prep school, Harvard roommate, and current business partner in a venture capital firm that specialized in tech startups. He was also one of the people who'd been most vocal about his surprise at Marcus's choice in fiancée. James, I managed, forcing a smile. Good to see you. Likewise. I heard you were here for the wedding summit. His grin had an edge to it that I'd learned to recognize, the expression of someone who thought they were being clever. How did it go? Fine. Vivian and Caroline have everything well in hand. Oh, I'm sure they do. They're professional event planners at this point. James fell into step beside me as I started walking toward the subway station. You know, I've been meaning to tell you, I think it's great what you're doing. I slowed my pace, wary. What I'm doing? This whole thing, he gestured vaguely at the air between us, accepting help with the wedding costs. A lot of women would let pride get in the way, but you're being practical, smart. The condescension in his voice was so thick, I could practically taste it. He thought he was complimenting me, acknowledging my wisdom in accepting charity. The urge to tell him exactly how wrong he was burned in my throat like acid. Marcus is lucky to have someone so grounded, James continued. Someone who understands that love is more important than keeping up appearances. Yes, I said quietly. I suppose it is. I mean, not everyone could handle being part of this family. The expectations, the obligations, the social responsibilities, but you seem to be adapting well. Adapting. Like I was a pet being house-trained. Thanks, James. That's, very supportive of you. He didn't hear the irony in my voice or chose to ignore it. Anytime. We all want this to work out. Marcus seems happy, and that's what matters. After he left me at the subway entrance with another patronizing smile, I stood on the platform waiting for my train and trying to process the rage that was building in my chest like steam in a pressure cooker. Every interaction lately felt like a test I was failing without knowing the rules. Every conversation contained layers of meaning that left me feeling off balance and defensive. The train car was crowded with evening commuters, a mix of professionals heading home to their families and service workers starting evening shifts. I found myself studying their faces, wondering about their stories. Did the woman in scrubs know that her tired eyes reflect deeper exhaustion than money could cure? Did the man in the expensive suit realize that his phone conversation about quarterly projections sounded hollow and meaningless to everyone around him? At my stop, I climbed the stairs to street level and walked the familiar route to Meridian Books. Samuel was still there, working late on a new shipment of rare manuscripts that had arrived from an estate sale in Boston. "Elena! Good! I was hoping you'd stop by," he called from the back room. "Come look at this!" I found him bent over a leather-bound volume, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. The book was clearly old, its pages yellowed with age but still intact. "It's a first edition of Emily Dickinson," he said, his voice filled with the kind of reverence reserved for religious artifacts. The estate attorney said they found it in a trunk in the attic. The family had no idea what they had. I approached carefully, drawn by the same magnetic pull that rare books always exerted on me. The cover was worn but elegant, and when Samuel opened it to show me the title page, I felt that familiar flutter of excitement that came with being in the presence of something truly special. "It's beautiful," I whispered, not wanting to disturb the quiet reverence of the moment. "There's more," Samuel said, his eyes twinkling. "Look at the provenance." He pointed to an inscription on the inside cover, written in fading brown ink. "To Margaret, with admiration and affection, E. Dickinson, 1885. My breath caught. A presentation copy, inscribed by the poet herself. The value was almost impossible to calculate, not just monetary, but historical, cultural, deeply personal. "Samuel, this is incredible. The museum would—" "Already called them," he said, closing the book carefully. "But here's the thing. I don't think I want to sell it to them. I think it belongs here, with people who will love it for what it is, rather than what it's worth." I understood what he was saying. Museums were wonderful, but they were also institutional. This book would be preserved behind glass, studied by scholars, admired from a distance. Here, it would be part of a living collection, touched by hands that understood its beauty. "What do you need?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "The insurance alone will be astronomical, and the security system will need to be upgraded. Climate control, monitoring, all of it." Samuel ran his hand through his thinning hair. "I know it's a lot to ask, but with your inheritance money—" "Yes," I said without hesitation, "whatever you need." Samuel's relief was palpable. "Elena, I can't tell you what this means, to keep something like this in the community, accessible to people who might never otherwise see—" "It's what she would have wanted," I interrupted, thinking of my grandmother's lessons about the responsibility that came with resources. Literature belongs with people who love it. As I walked home through the darkening streets,
I carried with me the contrast between my two worlds with sharp clarity. At the bookstore, my money had meaning. It preserved art, supported literature, created something beautiful that would outlast us all. In the Ashworth conference room, I'd been reduced to a charity case, graciously accepting help I didn't need while being edited out of my own life story. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. "Ms. Vasquez." The voice was crisp, professional, with the kind of authority that made people pay attention. "This is Jonathan Hartwell from Hartwell, Bishop and Associates. I'm calling regarding your trust fund." I sat up straighter in my kitchen chair, coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips. Jonathan had been my grandmother's lawyer, then mine, but our interactions had been limited to annual statements and the occasional adjustment to my investment portfolio. "Is everything all right?"
More than all right, actually. I'm calling because you're approaching your 25th birthday, which triggers certain provisions in your grandmother's will that I need to discuss with you in person. Can you come to the office this week? My 25th birthday. I'd been so consumed with wedding planning and navigating Marcus's social world that I'd almost forgotten. In 3 weeks, I would officially reach the age my grandmother had specified in her instructions, the mysterious milestone she'd referenced in our last conversation. What kind of provisions? The kind that are better discussed face-to-face. How's Thursday at 2 o'clock? After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone, a mixture of anticipation and dread churning in my stomach. My grandmother had been full of surprises, layers of complexity that I was still discovering years after her death. What had she planned for this moment? Thursday's meeting with Jonathan took place in his law office in the financial district, a space that breathed old money and older discretion. The walls were lined with leather-bound volumes and oil paintings of distinguished men in dark suits, the kind of place where fortunes were managed and secrets were kept. "Elena." Jonathan rose from behind his massive desk, extending a hand that felt like shaking hands with history itself. He was probably 70, with silver hair and the kind of presence that came from decades of handling other people's most sensitive affairs. "You look so much like your grandmother at that age. She would be proud." We settled into leather chairs beside a window that looked down on the city's financial heart. Jonathan opened a thick file that had my name embossed in gold lettering on the tab. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he began, pulling out documents I'd never seen before. "When she first came to this country, she had nothing but intelligence, determination, and an uncanny ability to recognize opportunity. By the time she passed, she'd built something extraordinary." I knew the basic story, how my grandmother had arrived from Mexico as a young woman, worked multiple jobs while learning English, married my grandfather who'd been a successful businessman, and invested wisely after his death. But Jonathan's tone suggested there was more to the narrative. "The trust fund you've been living off is actually just the interest from a much larger estate. Your grandmother wanted you to prove you could live modestly, make good choices, understand the value of money before you inherited the principal." I looked down at the number on the page and felt the world tilt sideways. The figure was so large it seemed fictional, the kind of wealth that appeared in Forbes articles about tech moguls and oil barons. "This can't be right," I whispered. "It's very right. Your grandmother was one of the earliest investors in several tech companies that are now household names. She also owned significant real estate holdings that have appreciated considerably over the past decade." Jonathan's smile was gentle but knowing. "Elena, you're not just wealthy, you're one of the richest young women in the city." I stared at the papers spread across the desk, trying to process what this meant. The trust fund I'd been carefully managing was pocket change compared to this. The wedding expenses that had everyone so concerned about my supposed limitations were less than I spent on coffee in a month. "There's more," Jonathan continued. "Your grandmother left specific instructions for how this information should be revealed. She wanted you to experience the world as it really is, to see how people treat those they perceive as having less power, less influence. She believed it would make you a better steward of the resources you'd eventually inherit." She was testing me. I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. She was preparing you. There's a difference. Jonathan handed me another document. She also left instructions about your wedding. My hands shook as I unfolded the letter, written in my grandmother's elegant script. Mi querida Elena, if you are reading this, you have found someone worth marrying, and I am happy for you. But I want you to know that you never have to accept charity, condescension, or disrespect from anyone, including your new family. You have the power to create the life you want, the wedding you dream of, the future you deserve. Use it wisely, but use it. Con amor siempre, Abuela Isabella.
I read the letter 3 times before looking up at Jonathan, who was watching me with something that might have been paternal pride. "What do I do now?" I asked. "Whatever you want," he replied simply. "You have complete control over all assets as of your 25th birthday. You can remain anonymous, go public, or find some middle ground. The choice is entirely yours." I left Jonathan's office in a daze, walking through the financial district like a ghost haunting her former life. Everything looked different now. The expensive restaurants where I'd never thought I could afford to eat, the luxury boutiques I'd walked past without entering, the world that had seemed so far above my reach suddenly felt small and accessible. But with the revelation came a new weight of responsibility. How do you tell the man you love that you've been lying to him about who you are? How do you face his family knowing they've been pitying someone who could buy and sell them? How do you step into a new identity without destroying the relationships built on the old one? That evening, Marcus and I had dinner at a small Italian restaurant in my neighborhood, the kind of place with checked tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. He'd suggested somewhere more upscale, but I'd insisted on familiar ground. I needed the comfort of known surroundings for what I was about to do. "You're quiet tonight," Marcus observed, reaching across the table to take my hand. "The wedding planning isn't stressing you out too much, is it? I know my family can be overwhelming." I looked at his face, studying the features I'd memorized over the past year. The strong jawline, the laugh lines around his eyes, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he was relaxed. This was the man who'd fallen in love with Elena the bookstore clerk, who'd defended me against his friend's skepticism, who'd made me feel beautiful and worthy and enough. "Marcus, I need to tell you something." Something in my tone made him straighten, his lawyer instincts sensing serious conversation ahead. "What is it?" "I haven't been completely honest with you about my background." His hand tightened around mine, but his expression remained steady. "Okay, what haven't you told me?" I took a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff. "I have money, a lot of money. More than your family, more than you, more than most people can imagine." Marcus blinked, processing this information like data that didn't compute. "What kind of money?" "The kind where the wedding your mother is graciously paying for would be less than I spend on books in a year. The kind where I could buy the country club if I wanted to." I watched his face carefully, looking for signs of how this news was landing. "Elena," he said slowly, "are you telling me you're rich?" "I'm telling you I'm very rich." "How rich?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the email Jonathan had sent summarizing the portfolio. Marcus looked at the screen for a long moment, then set the phone down carefully on the table.
Jesus Christ. I know it's a lot to process. A lot to process? Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his way of dealing with stress. "Elena, this changes everything." The words hit me like ice water. "What do you mean it changes everything?" "I mean," he paused, clearly struggling to organize his thoughts. "I mean, my family has been treating you like some kind of charity case. My mother has been planning a wedding based on the assumption that you can't afford anything. James has been making jokes about gold diggers and social climbing. Everyone thinks I'm the one with the money in this relationship. And does that matter?" Marcus looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Doesn't it?" The question hung between us like a weapon neither of us wanted to pick up. I realized that in all my planning for this conversation, I'd never considered that Marcus might be the one who struggled with the revelation. "I need some air," he said abruptly, standing from the table. I need to think about this." I watched him leave, walking quickly past the restaurant's windows without looking back. The other diners continued their conversations, unaware that my world had just shifted on its axis. The waiter approached, cautiously, asking if everything was all right, if I needed anything else. What I needed was to understand whether the man I was supposed to marry in 6 weeks could love Elena the heiress as much as he'd loved Elena the bookstore clerk. What I needed was to know if honesty had just cost me everything that mattered. I paid the check with cash from my wallet, bills that suddenly felt like play money, and walked home through streets that looked exactly the same but felt completely different. Tomorrow, I would turn 25 and officially become one of the wealthiest women in the city. Tonight, I was just a girl sitting in her small apartment, wondering if she'd just lost the love of her life by telling him the truth. My 25th birthday arrived on a Tuesday that felt like any other day, except for the weight of secrets that had grown too heavy to carry. I woke to sunlight streaming through my apartment windows and the sound of Mrs. Patterson's television, providing its usual morning soundtrack. But everything was different now. Had been different since Marcus walked out of the restaurant 3 days ago without saying when he'd call. He hadn't called. I dressed for work in the same clothes I'd worn for 2 years, but they felt like a costume now, a performance of normalcy that no longer fit. The walk to Meridian Books took me past the construction site where luxury condos were rising like glass monuments to new money, past the coffee shop where young entrepreneurs pitched dreams over expensive lattes, past all the markers of a city where wealth and poverty existed side by side in an elaborate dance of proximity without connection. Samuel was already at the store when I arrived, unpacking a shipment of contemporary fiction. He looked up as I entered, his expression concerned. "Elena, dear, you look like you haven't been sleeping." "I haven't been sleeping much," I admitted, hanging my coat on the hook behind the register. "Want to talk about it?" Before I could answer, the door chimed, and Margaret Chen entered, bringing with her that particular brand of elegant authority that made even casual encounters feel significant. Today, she wore a black cashmere coat and carried a leather portfolio that suggested business rather than pleasure. "Elena," she said, approaching the counter with purpose, "I was hoping to find you here. We need to talk."
Samuel, recognizing the gravity in her tone, retreated to the back office with diplomatic sensitivity. Margaret waited until we were alone before opening her portfolio and removing a newspaper clipping. "Have you seen this?" she asked, placing it on the counter between us. It was from the society page of the morning paper, a small item buried among announcements of charity galas and board appointments. Sources close to the Ashworth family report that the upcoming wedding between Marcus Ashworth III and local bookstore clerk Elena Vasquez may be postponed indefinitely. The couple was seen having what appeared to be an intense conversation at Romano's restaurant Tuesday evening, after which Mr. Ashworth left alone. No official statement has been made by the family. I stared at the words, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way that made my skin crawl. Someone had been watching us, reporting on the most painful moment of my relationship like it was entertainment. "Margaret, I can explain." "You don't need to explain anything to me," she interrupted gently. "But you do need to understand that the story is already writing itself, and right now, you're letting other people hold the pen." She sat down in the chair beside the counter, studying my face with the kind of attention that missed nothing. "Elena, I've been navigating these social waters for 30 years. I know what it looks like when someone is carrying a secret that's too big for them. The question is whether you're ready to trust me with whatever it is you're hiding." The kindness in her voice was my undoing. All the careful control I'd maintained for 3 years crumbled, and suddenly I was telling her everything about my grandmother's trust fund, about the inheritance that had just multiplied beyond my wildest understanding, about Marcus's reaction and the 3 days of silence that had followed. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally nodding but never showing surprise. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and regarded me with something that looked like admiration. "Well," she said finally, "that explains a few things." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been wondering how a part-time bookstore clerk could afford Hermès scarves and handmade Italian shoes, even if she wore them with jeans and thought no one would notice." Margaret's smile held warmth and understanding. "Quality recognizes quality, Elena. I knew there was more to your story than you were telling." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "You knew?" "I suspected. Your education shows in ways that can't be faked, and your taste is too refined to have been developed on a bookstore salary. But I didn't know the extent of it." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "What I don't understand is why you're sitting here feeling sorry for yourself instead of taking control of your narrative." "What do you mean?" Margaret stood, pacing to the window, where morning light illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. "I mean that right now, the story being told about you is that you're a gold digger who got caught, or a social climber who overreached, or a poor girl who couldn't handle the pressure of marrying up. Is that the story you want people to believe?" The thought of being defined by other people's assumptions made something fierce and protective rise in my chest. "No." "Then don't let them write it. Write your own story." Before I could ask what she meant, the door chimed again, and this time it was Caroline Ashworth who entered, her usual perfect composure slightly frayed around the edges. She looked around the bookstore like she was seeing it for the first time, taking in the narrow aisles and overstuffed shelves with the expression of someone who'd stumbled into unfamiliar territory.
"Elena," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "we need to talk." Margaret gathered her things with smooth efficiency. "I'll leave you two alone," she said. But before she left, she leaned down to whisper in my ear, "Remember what I said about holding the pen?" Caroline waited until Margaret was gone before approaching the counter, her heels clicking against the wooden floor with sharp precision. Up close, I could see the strain around her eyes, the careful makeup that couldn't quite hide the fact that she'd been losing sleep too. "Is it true?" she asked without preamble. "Is what true?" "What Marcus told us about your financial situation." The way she said financial situation made it sound like a disease or embarrassing medical condition. I felt my spine straighten with defensive pride. "That depends on what he told you." Caroline's laugh was sharp and humorless. "He told us that you're richer than God and have been lying to all of us for over a year. He told us that while we've been treating you like some kind of charity case, you could probably buy our entire family business without breaking a sweat." She paused, her eyes flashing with something that looked like anger. "He told us that everything we thought we knew about you was wrong." "Not everything," I said quietly. "I still work here. I still love books. I still love your brother." "Do you?" Caroline's question was sharp as a blade, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been playing some kind of elaborate game with all of us, making us look like fools while you laughed behind our backs. The accusation hit like a physical blow. That's not what this was about. Then what was it about? Help me understand how someone lies about being poor for fun. I felt anger rising in my throat, hot and defensive. I wasn't lying about being poor. I was choosing to live modestly. There's a difference. Is there? Because the result is the same. You let us all make assumptions about you that weren't true. You let my mother plan a wedding based on a budget that doesn't exist. You let James make jokes about gold diggers while you sat there knowing you could buy and sell him. You made Marcus feel like he had to protect and provide for someone who was perfectly capable of taking care of herself. Each accusation felt like another weight added to the guilt I'd been carrying. I was protecting myself. From what? From being loved for who you really are? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to examine. Caroline studied my face, her expression softening slightly. Elena, I'll admit that I wasn't thrilled when Marcus first brought you home. You were different from the women he'd dated before, and I was worried about his judgment. But I came to respect you. I liked that you weren't impressed by our money, that you seemed to value Marcus for who he was rather than what he could give you. She paused, shaking her head. Now I found out that you weren't impressed because you already had more than we did. That changes the entire dynamic. Does it? I asked, genuinely confused. Does it matter why I wasn't impressed as long as I loved him for the right reasons? Of course it matters. Relationships are built on honesty, Elena, on knowing who you're dealing with. Marcus fell in love with someone who doesn't exist. I exist, I said, my voice rising with emotion. Everything about me is real except the size of my bank account. The size of your bank account changes everything. It changes the power balance, the expectations, the entire foundation of your relationship. Marcus has spent a year thinking he was the financially stable one, the one who could provide security. Now he finds out that not only do you not need his security, you could provide security for him. That's emasculating.
I stared at Caroline, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. She wasn't just Marcus's sister or Vivian's daughter. She was a woman who understood the complex mathematics of relationships in their social circle, the delicate balance of power and prestige that governed their world. "So, what do I do?" I asked, hating the vulnerability in my voice. Caroline was quiet for a long moment, considering. "First, you need to decide what you want. Do you want Marcus back? Do you want to be part of our family? Do you want to live in our world? Because if you do, you need to understand that your secret changes the rules of the game." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you're not the underdog anymore, Elena. You're not the sweet girl from the wrong side of the tracks who captured a prince's heart. You're a wealthy woman who chose to deceive the man she claimed to love. That's a different story, and it requires different strategies." The door chimed again, and this time it was Marcus himself who entered, looking haggard and uncertain. His eyes found mine immediately, and I saw a mixture of pain and confusion that made my heart ache. "Caroline," he said, not taking his eyes off me, "what are you doing here?" "Having a conversation that should have happened months ago," she replied, gathering her purse. "I'll leave you two alone, but Marcus, remember what we talked about what you want and what you're willing to forgive." After she left, Marcus and I stood on opposite sides of the counter like adversaries preparing for battle. The silence stretched between us, filled with 3 days' worth of unspoken words and the weight of a revelation that had changed everything. "Elena," he said finally, his voice hoarse, "I don't even know where to start." "Start with whether you still love me," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Marcus closed his eyes, pain flickering across his features. "That's the problem. I do still love you, but I don't know who you are anymore." "I'm the same person." "No, you're not." His voice was gentle but firm. "The Elena I fell in love with was vulnerable, dependent on me in some ways. She needed my support, my protection. She was grateful for things I could give her. This Elena, the real Elena, doesn't need any of that. She's been humoring me. That's not true, isn't it? Haven't you been playing a part this whole time? The struggling bookstore clerk who was so grateful for expensive dinners and weekend trips? The girlfriend who let my family pay for wedding expenses you could have covered with pocket change?" I wanted to deny it, but the truth in his words was undeniable. I had been playing a part, even if I'd told myself it was for good reasons. "Marcus, everything I felt for you was real. Every moment we shared, every conversation, every time I told you I loved you, that was all real. But it was based on a lie. It was based on incomplete information. There's a difference." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is there? Because from where I'm standing, it feels like I've been dating someone's idea of who they thought I wanted them to be." The accusation stung,
because it contained just enough truth to be devastating. What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry for having money? That I'm sorry for trying to protect myself from people who might love my bank account more than they love me?
I want you to be sorry for lying to me for over a year. I want you to acknowledge that you made choices that affected both of us without giving me the information I needed to make my own choices. We stood there, staring at each other across the counter, and I realized that this wasn't just about money or honesty. This was about the fundamental question of who we were to each other, whether our relationship could survive the truth of who I really was. "So, what happens now?" I asked. Marcus was quiet for so long, I wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I need time to figure out how I feel about all of this. About you, about us, about what any of it means. And the wedding? I think we need to postpone it. At least until we figure out whether we still have a relationship worth celebrating." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting them. Postponing the wedding meant admitting publicly that our fairy tale had complications, that the perfect love story everyone had been watching wasn't so perfect after all. "How long?" I asked. "I don't know that either." Marcus left without kissing me goodbye, without any of the casual affection that had marked our relationship for the past year. I watched him walk past the window, his shoulders set with the kind of tension that suggested he was carrying a weight he wasn't sure how to bear. Samuel emerged from the back office, his face creased with concern. "Everything all right, dear?" I looked around the bookstore, at the shelves filled with stories of love and loss, triumph and tragedy, all the human experiences that seemed so much more manageable when they were happening to fictional characters. "I think I'm about to find out," I said. The charity gala was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art on a Thursday evening when autumn had painted the city in shades of amber and gold. I hadn't planned to attend, hadn't even known about it until Margaret called to inform me that my presence was not just expected, but necessary. "Elena, darling," she'd said in that tone that brooked no argument, "hiding won't solve anything. You need to show them who you really are." So, here I was, standing in the Temple of Dendor wearing a midnight blue gown that cost more than most people's monthly rent, my grandmother's diamond earrings catching the light like captured stars. The dress was couture, custom made by a designer whose client list read like a who's who of international royalty. My hair had been styled by the same woman who did magazine covers, and my makeup applied by an artist whose day rate could fund a small nonprofit. For the first time in my adult life, I looked like the money I had. The transformation had been Margaret's idea. "If you're going to reveal yourself," she had said during our planning session, "do it with style. Make it impossible for them to ignore you or dismiss you." The strategy was working. I could feel the shift in attention as I moved through the crowd, the way conversations paused when I approached, the reassessment happening in real time as people who'd cataloged me as Marcus's little bookstore girlfriend tried to reconcile that image with the woman before them. Patricia Whitmore materialized at my elbow, her eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that fed on other people's secrets. "Elena Vasquez, you look different tonight."
"Thank you," I replied, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "It's a beautiful event. The museum outdid themselves with the decorations." "Yes, well, when you're raising money for arts education, ambience matters." Patricia's gaze swept over my dress, jewelry, the subtle but unmistakable markers of serious wealth. "I don't believe I've seen that gown before. Is it new?" The question was loaded with implication. Patricia had the kind of encyclopedic knowledge of designer fashion that came from decades of society events. She knew this dress wasn't from a department store. "It is," I confirmed. "I thought the occasion called for something special." "Indeed." Patricia's smile had a predatory quality. "I heard about the postponement of your wedding. Such a shame. Though perhaps it's for the best. Better to discover incompatibilities before the ceremony rather than after." The comment was designed to wound, to reduce my situation to a simple case of social climbing gone wrong. 6 months ago, it might have worked. Tonight, it rolled off me like water. "Oh, I don't think it's about incompatibilities," I said, meeting her gaze directly. "Sometimes relationships just need time to evolve, to accommodate new information." Before Patricia could respond, the crowd shifted and Marcus appeared in our line of sight. He was standing with a group of his business associates, looking handsome but strained in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. Our eyes met across the room, and I saw surprise flicker across his features as he took in my transformed appearance. "Excuse me," I said to Patricia, who was watching the exchange with avid interest. "I see someone I need to speak with." I crossed the room with the kind of confidence that came from knowing I belonged here, not because of who I was dating, but because of who I was. The conversations around me seemed to part like water as I approached Marcus's group. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying the polish of finishing school elocution lessons I'd taken at 16. "Marcus." "Elena?" His voice was carefully controlled, but I could see the questions in his eyes. "You look stunning." "Thank you." I turned to his companions, extending my hand with practiced grace. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Elena Vasquez." The men, hedge fund managers and real estate developers, shook my hand with the kind of attention that suggested they were reassessing everything they'd previously assumed about me. Word traveled fast in these circles, and while the exact details of my financial situation might not be public knowledge, enough whispers had circulated to pique curiosity. "Miss Vasquez," said Richard Sterling, a man whose name appeared regularly in the financial press. "I understand congratulations are in order. Jonathan Hartwell speaks very highly of your grandmother's investment acumen." The mention of Jonathan's name sent a ripple of recognition through the group. Hartwell, Bishop, and Associates didn't handle small accounts, and their client list was legendary for its exclusivity. My grandmother was a remarkable woman. She taught me that wealth is a tool, not a trophy. The question isn't how much you have, but what you choose to do with it. "Wise words," Richard nodded. "I'd love to hear more about your philanthropic interests. Perhaps we could schedule lunch." It was happening. The subtle recalibration of my social standing that came with revealed wealth. Suddenly, I wasn't Marcus's charity case girlfriend. I was a person worth knowing, worth courting, worth including in conversations about real influence. "I'd enjoy that," I said, then turned back to Marcus. "Could I steal you away for a moment? There's something I'd like to show you." Marcus excused himself from the group, following me through the crowd toward the museum's permanent collection. We walked in silence past Egyptian artifacts and Renaissance paintings, the weight of our unresolved issues heavy between us. I stopped in front of a small gallery that housed medieval manuscripts, their illuminated pages glowing under carefully controlled lighting. "Do you know why I love books?" I asked, not looking at him. Marcus moved to stand beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, the familiar scent that had once meant safety and home. "Tell me." "Because they revealed their secrets slowly. You can read the same book at different stages of your life and discover new meanings, new depths you missed before." I turned to face him. "People are like that too. We're all works in progress, revealing ourselves in chapters." "Elena, let me finish." I took a breath, gathering courage. "You're right that I wasn't completely honest with you. But you're wrong about why." Marcus waited, his lawyer's training evident in his patience. "I didn't hide my wealth because I was playing games or testing you. I hid it because I was terrified that anyone who knew about the money would never see past it to who I actually am." I looked down at my hands, at the engagement ring I was still wearing. My grandmother warned me about that. She said wealth changes how people treat you, how they see you, what they expect from you. She wanted me to experience being loved for myself first. But don't you see how that reasoning undermines everything? Marcus's voice held familiar pain. By hiding it, you made it impossible for me to prove that I could love you regardless of your bank account. You took away my chance to show you that the money didn't matter. Did it matter? I asked quietly. When Caroline told me about how emasculating my wealth was, how it changed the power balance of our relationship, was she wrong? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at an illuminated manuscript from the 13th century. No, he said finally. It does change things. It makes me question everything I thought I knew about us. Such as whether you needed me at all, or whether you were just experimenting, seeing what it was like to date someone who thought he was taking care of you when you could take care of yourself better than I ever could. I reached out and touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. Marcus, I've never needed anyone to take care of me financially, but I've never needed anyone's love the way I need yours. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy what we had. Had? Marcus repeated, the past tense hitting me like a physical blow. Have, I corrected firmly. What we have. Because despite the lies of omission and the hurt feelings and the postponed wedding, I still love you. And I think you still love me. Marcus closed his eyes, leaning against the gallery wall. I do love you. That's what makes this so damn complicated. Before I could respond, we were interrupted by the sound of applause from the main hall. The evening's program was beginning, and we made our way back to find seats for the presentations. The gala was raising money for arts education in underserved communities, a cause that resonated deeply with my own values. As speaker after speaker talked about the transformative power of creativity and culture, I found myself thinking about the Dickinson manuscript at Meridian Books, about the importance of keeping art accessible rather than locked away in private collections. When the formal program ended and the dancing began, I excused myself and found a quiet corner where I could use my phone. The call I made was to Jonathan Hartwell's personal number. Jonathan, I said, I need to make a donation, a significant one, and I need to make it tonight. What did you have in mind? $5 million to the museum's education program, anonymous for now, but with a specific stipulation that they create a partnership with independent bookstores to bring rare manuscripts and first editions into community spaces. I want literature to live where people can touch it, not just admire it from behind glass.
Consider it done, Jonathan said, and I could hear the approval in his voice. Your grandmother would be proud. 20 minutes later, the museum's director was making an impromptu announcement about an extraordinary anonymous donation that would transform their community outreach programs. I watched from across the room as the news rippled through the crowd, saw the speculation in people's eyes as they wondered who among them had written such a substantial check. Margaret appeared at my side, elegant as always in silver silk. That was beautifully done, she murmured, though I suspect anonymity won't last long in this crowd. She was right. Within an hour, whispers were circulating about the mysterious donor, and by some combination of social media detective work and educated guessing, my name was being mentioned with increasing frequency. I found myself surrounded by board members and philanthropic organizers, all suddenly interested in my thoughts on arts funding and community engagement. Miss Vasquez, said Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the curator of manuscripts at the museum, I understand you have a particular passion for making literature accessible. I'd love to discuss some ideas we've been developing. As we talked, I became aware of Marcus watching from across the room. He stood with a small group that included his parents and Caroline, their expressions ranging from surprise to calculation, as they observed my transformation from wallflower to center of attention. The evening's final surprise came when William Ashworth III approached me as the gala was winding down. Marcus's father moved with the authority of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room, but tonight his usual confidence seemed tempered with something that might have been respect. Elena, he said, extending his hand, that was quite a gesture tonight, the museum donation. It seemed like a worthy cause, I replied carefully. Indeed, William studied me with the same analytical intensity I'd seen Marcus use in professional settings. I owe you an apology.
The admission was so unexpected that I felt momentarily off balance. Sir? We all did. We saw what we expected to see instead of looking deeper. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Your son tells me that your financial capabilities are quite substantial. They are. And yet you chose to work in a bookstore, to live modestly, to let us all assume you needed our help. Why? I thought of my grandmother's letters, her warnings about the isolating nature of wealth, her determination that I should understand the world as it really was before taking my place in it. Because I wanted to know who would love Elena Vasquez the person, not Elena Vasquez the trust fund. I wanted relationships based on genuine connection rather than social advantage. William nodded slowly. Your grandmother's wisdom, I assume. Isabella Vasquez was a formidable woman. I had the pleasure of meeting her once at a charity auction. She outbid me on a Monet, then donated it to the Children's Hospital. His smile held genuine warmth. She told me that money was only as good as the purposes it served. You knew my grandmother? By reputation, certainly. By the time I realized we moved in some of the same circles, she was already quite ill. But I remember thinking that she was the kind of person who understood that true wealth isn't about what you own, but what you give. The conversation was interrupted by Marcus himself, who approached with the careful uncertainty that had marked our interactions since the revelation. Elena, he said, could I drive you home? I think we need to talk. The car ride through the city's quiet streets was filled with the kind of silence that precedes important conversations. Marcus's hands were steady on the steering wheel, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw worked as he processed everything that had happened. That donation tonight, $5 million. Yes, you made it look effortless.
I turned to study his profile in the passing streetlights. It was effortless. That's the thing about having more money than you can reasonably spend. Generosity becomes easy. Is that what you've been doing? Being generous with me by pretending to need less than you have? The question was asked without anger, but with a kind of sad understanding that cut deeper than accusations would have. Maybe, I admitted. I don't know anymore. The lines got blurred somewhere between protecting myself and protecting you from having to compete with my bank account. Marcus pulled over in front of my building, but neither of us moved to get out. We sat in the car as the engine ticked cooling. Two people who'd loved each other completely, trying to figure out whether love was enough to bridge the gap that honesty had created. Elena, Marcus said finally, I need you to understand something. It's not about the money itself. It's about the choice you made to hide it. It's about what that says about your trust in me, in us. And I need you to understand that I made that choice before I knew you. It was a wall I built to protect myself, and by the time I realized I wanted to tear it down, I was afraid it was too late. Is it too late? I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the hurt and confusion to the man I'd fallen in love with. The man who'd spent a year treating me like I was precious, who'd defended me against his friend's skepticism, who'd made me feel worthy of love even when I was lying to him about who I was. I don't know, I said honestly. That depends on whether you can forgive me for being afraid, and whether you can love the real Elena as much as you loved the version I thought you wanted. Marcus reached across the center console and took my hand, his thumb tracing over the engagement ring I was still wearing. The real Elena, he said slowly, donated $5 million to arts education without blinking. The real Elena has been using her trust fund to preserve rare books and support independent literature. The real Elena chose to work in a bookstore not because she had to, but because she wanted to be surrounded by stories. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. The real Elena also lied to you for over a year. Yeah, Marcus said softly, she did. And I'm still figuring out how I feel about that. He walked me to my door, the familiar routine feeling both comforting and strange after everything that had changed.
At the entrance of my building, he paused, his hand still holding mine. Elena, I want to try to work through this. I want to find a way back to us, but it's going to take time and it's going to require complete honesty going forward. No more secrets. No more protecting me from who you are. No more secrets, I promised. And I need you to stop working at the bookstore. The words hit me like cold water. What? You heard me. If we're going to build something real, it has to be based on truth. The bookstore job was part of the performance, the illusion of being someone you're not. I need to see who Elena Vasquez really is when she's not pretending to need a paycheck. I started to argue, to explain that the bookstore wasn't pretense, but genuine passion. But Marcus was already stepping away. Think about it. Think about what kind of life you want to build, and whether it's one where you're hiding from your resources or using them. Think about whether you want to be Elena the bookstore clerk or Elena the philanthropist who happens to love books.
As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, Marcus's words echoed in my mind. He was asking me to choose not just between versions of myself, but between entire ways of being in the world. The question wasn't whether I could afford to quit my job. Financially, I could buy the entire bookstore chain if I wanted. The question was whether I was ready to step fully into the life my grandmother had prepared me for, to stop hiding behind the comfortable fiction of ordinary circumstances. In my bedroom, I hung the couture gown carefully in my closet, next to the simple dresses and jeans that had been my uniform for 3 years. The contrast was stark. Expensive fabric next to off-the-rack cotton, diamonds next to costume jewelry, the woman I was becoming next to the woman I'd been pretending to be. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, staring at the blank document that had been waiting for weeks. Tonight, for the first time, I began to write not about Elena the character, but about Elena the person, about the trust fund and the lies, the love and the fear, the moment when hiding became harder than revealing. The story that emerged was messier than fiction, more complicated than fairy tales. It was about a woman learning that money could isolate as easily as it could liberate, that love required not just honesty, but courage, that sometimes the hardest person to be true to was yourself. As dawn light began to filter through my windows, I saved the document and closed the laptop. Tomorrow, I would have to decide whether to give Samuel my notice, whether to step fully into the life I'd inherited, or continue living in the margins of my own story. 6 months later, the Vasquez Literary Foundation occupied the entire 3rd floor of a renovated building in the Arts District, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a neighborhood where galleries mixed with coffee shops and young artists shared space with established writers. I stood in my office, watching the morning sun paint the hardwood floors golden, and marveled at how much had changed since that night at the museum. My resignation from Meridian Books had been one of the hardest conversations of my life. Samuel had listened with the kind of paternal understanding that made leaving even more difficult, but he'd also been the first to congratulate me when I'd explained my plans for the foundation. "Your grandmother would be proud," he'd said, echoing Jonathan Hartwell's words. "You're taking everything she taught you and making it bigger than just yourself." The foundation focused on 3 core missions: preserving literary heritage, supporting independent bookstores, and creating educational programs that brought rare books and manuscripts into communities that might never otherwise encounter them. We'd already funded preservation projects in 12 cities, established reading programs in underserved schools, and created partnerships between major museums and neighborhood bookstores. It was work that felt like purpose rather than obligation, a way of using my resources that honored both my grandmother's legacy and my own passions. The foundation had given me an identity that was entirely my own. Not Elena the bookstore clerk, not Elena the trust fund baby, but Elena the philanthropist, who understood that stories belonged to everyone.
Margaret Chen had become my unofficial mentor, guiding me through the complex world of high-level charity work with the same grace she'd once used to navigate society dinners. The key, she'd told me over lunch at her country club, is remembering that influence is more valuable than money. Money can fund programs, but influence can change systems. Today marked the Foundation's official launch party, an evening event that would bring together writers, publishers, educators, and philanthropists to celebrate our first year of accomplishments. The guest list read like a who's who of the literary world, mixed with the social elite I was still learning to navigate on my own terms rather than as Marcus's girlfriend. Because that's what I was now, on my own terms. Marcus and I had tried for 3 months to rebuild what we'd had, meeting for carefully orchestrated dinners and awkward conversations that felt more like negotiations than romance. He'd been trying to fall in love with Elena the heiress, while I'd been trying to figure out how to be her. The effort had been exhausting for both of us. The final conversation had happened in the same Italian restaurant where I first told him the truth about my wealth. We'd sat across from each other like polite strangers, picking at pasta neither of us wanted to eat. "I keep waiting to stop being angry," Marcus had said, his voice tired. "I keep thinking that if I give it enough time, I'll be able to get past the feeling that you didn't trust me enough to be honest."
And I keep waiting to stop feeling guilty, I'd replied. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is that we're both different people than we were a year ago, and we need to figure out if these new versions of ourselves can work together. We'd sat in silence for a while, both of us understanding that the answer was probably no. "I do love you," Marcus had said as we prepared to leave, "but I think I love who we used to be more than who we are now, and that's not fair to either of us." The breakup had been surprisingly gentle, a mutual recognition that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the fundamental changes that shift the ground beneath a relationship. We'd returned our engagement rings to their boxes, divided up belongings that had become intertwined over a year of shared life, and said goodbye with the kind of sad affection that acknowledged what we'd meant to each other without pretending we could continue. The divorce of expectations had been harder than the breakup itself. His family had been surprisingly supportive. Caroline had even called to congratulate me on the Foundation's launch, saying she'd always respected my intelligence and was glad to see me using it. But the social circle we'd shared had required more complex navigation, with some people taking sides and others simply confused about how to categorize me now that I wasn't Marcus Ashworth's fiancée. I'd learned that wealth provided a different kind of freedom, the liberty to disappoint people without worrying about the consequences, to make choices based on personal values rather than social expectations. It was both liberating and lonely in ways I was still discovering. A knock on my office door interrupted my morning reflection. My assistant, David Kim, a recent Columbia graduate with a degree in library science and a passion for digital preservation, poked his head inside. "Elena, the photographer from Arts Quarterly, is here for the pre-event interview," he said, "and Margaret Chen called to confirm she'll be introducing you tonight." "Perfect. Send the photographer up in 5 minutes." As David retreated, I took a final look around the office that had become my professional home. The walls were lined with photographs from our various projects. Children reading in libraries we'd help fund, rare manuscripts being digitally preserved, bookstore owners cutting ribbons at grand reopenings. Each image represented a story, a life touched, a small victory in the larger battle to keep literature alive and accessible. The interview went well, focusing on the Foundation's mission rather than my personal story. I'd learned to deflect questions about Marcus and the broken engagement with practiced grace, redirecting attention toward the work rather than the woman funding it. The journalist was more interested in our innovative approach to literary preservation anyway, particularly our partnership with tech companies to create virtual reality experiences of historical libraries. "What's next for the Foundation?" she asked as our session wound down. "We're launching a program called Stories Without Borders. We'll be translating classic works into multiple languages and creating free digital libraries accessible anywhere in the world. Literature shouldn't be limited by geography or economics." That sounds incredibly ambitious. It is, but ambition is the only way to create real change. After the journalist left, I spent the afternoon reviewing final details for the evening's event. The party would be held in the Foundation's main gallery, surrounded by rotating exhibits of rare books and manuscripts on loan from private collectors and museums. Tonight's featured display included the Dickinson manuscript from Meridian Books. Samuel had agreed to loan it for the evening, understanding that its presence would help legitimize the Foundation's mission. As the sun set the city, I went home to my new apartment, a penthouse in a renovated warehouse building with exposed brick walls lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and windows that offered panoramic views of the city. It was the first space I'd ever designed entirely for myself, without considering anyone else's tastes or expectations. Every piece of furniture, every work of art, every book had been chosen because it spoke to me personally.
I dressed for the evening in a deep green silk dress that was elegant without being ostentatious, paired with my grandmother's pearl necklace and earrings that had been reset by a contemporary jewelry designer. The look was sophisticated but approachable, a visual representation of how I was learning to balance wealth with authenticity. The Foundation's gallery was transformed for the evening, with soft lighting that made the book displays glow like religious artifacts, and scattered cocktail tables that encouraged intimate conversations. Staff members in black moved through the crowd with champagne and canapes, while a string quartet played classical pieces that provided elegant background music without overwhelming conversation. The guest list was eclectic by design. Nobel Prize-winning authors mingled with young poets, museum curators talked with high school English teachers, tech entrepreneurs discussed digital preservation with elderly librarians who'd spent their careers protecting physical books. It was exactly the kind of mixing I'd hoped to create, breaking down barriers between different sectors of the literary world. Margaret found me near the Dickinson display, resplendent in navy blue silk and the kind of diamonds that spoke of old money rather than new wealth. "Elena, darling," she said, embracing me with genuine warmth, "this is extraordinary. You've created something really special here." "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without your guidance." "Nonsense. You had the vision and the resources. I just helped you navigate the politics." Margaret smiled, studying the crowd with approval. "Your grandmother would be so proud to see this." As if summoned by the mention of family, my cousin Rosa appeared at my side. She'd flown in from Los Angeles for the event, one of the few family members I'd stayed close to after my parents' deaths. Rosa was a high school teacher who'd always been proud of my bookstore job, thinking it showed admirable dedication to education over money. Learning about my wealth had required some adjustment on her part, but she'd eventually come to appreciate what I was trying to do with it. "Prima," she said, using the childhood nickname that reminded me of Sunday dinners at my grandmother's house. "This place is incredible. Abuela always said you'd do something important with your life." "I'm trying," I replied, meaning it. The formal program began at 8, with Margaret introducing me to the assembled crowd. Her words were generous and thoughtful, focusing on the Foundation's mission rather than my personal story, though she did manage to work in a subtle reference to the importance of young people using their resources responsibly. When I took the podium, I looked out at the faces gathered in the gallery, some familiar, some new, all united by a shared love of literature and learning. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the space. "When my grandmother first taught me to read, she told me that books were like seeds. They contained entire worlds waiting to grow, but only if they found the right soil, the right conditions, the right care." I paused, seeing nods of recognition from the teachers and librarians in the audience. The Vasquez Literary Foundation exists to provide that care, to create those conditions, to ensure that the seeds of story and imagination can take root wherever they're needed most. We believe that literature is not a luxury but a necessity, not entertainment but education, not decoration but transformation. The speech continued for 10 minutes, outlining our accomplishments and future goals, But what I remember most clearly was the moment when I looked out at the crowd and realized I wasn't performing anymore. I wasn't trying to be who anyone expected me to be. I was simply Elena Vasquez, telling the truth about work that mattered to me, surrounded by people who shared my passion. After the formal program, the evening shifted into a more relaxed reception. I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and discussing potential collaborations, feeling more comfortable in my own skin than I had in years. This was who I was supposed to be, not someone's girlfriend or someone's charity case, but a woman using her resources to make the world a little more literate, a little more connected to the power of story. 2 years later, the wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in the gardens of the Frick Collection, surrounded by roses in full bloom and the kind of intimate elegance that money could buy but couldn't manufacture. There were 40 guests, writers and teachers, foundation board members and old friends, the people who'd become my chosen family over the past few years. James Patterson, the celebrated author who'd become the Foundation's most prominent board member, walked me down the aisle. At 72, he'd taken on something of a paternal role in my life, offering guidance that was both professional and personal. "Elena," he said when I asked him to perform this honor, "it would be my privilege." The groom waiting at the altar was Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a professor of comparative literature at Columbia, who'd been consulting with the Foundation on our translation initiatives. He was brilliant and kind, passionate about making literature accessible across cultural boundaries, and completely unimpressed by my wealth, except insofar as it allowed him to pursue academic projects that might otherwise lack funding. We'd met during a heated debate about the ethics of modernizing classic texts for contemporary audiences. The argument had lasted 3 hours and ended with dinner, the first of many evenings spent discussing books and ideas and the responsibility that came with preserving cultural heritage. Michael understood that my money was a tool rather than an identity, and he loved me for my mind and heart rather than my bank account. Our relationship had developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared values, rather than the intense chemistry that had characterized my relationship with Marcus. It was deeper, but also more sustainable, founded on friendship and intellectual compatibility as much as romantic attraction. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, officiated by a judge who'd been a friend of my grandmother's. We'd written our own vows, promises about supporting each other's dreams, and using our combined resources, his intellectual, mine financial, to make the world more literate, more connected, more just. "Elena," Michael said when it was his turn to speak, "you've taught me that love isn't about completing each other, but about amplifying each other. You've shown me that the best partnerships are the ones where two people become more than the sum of their parts." When I spoke, I looked out at the small gathering of people who'd become my true community, not because of social obligation or family expectation, but because of genuine connection and shared purpose. "Michael, you've helped me understand that the most important stories are the ones we write together, not as individuals, but as partners committed to something larger than ourselves. Thank you for seeing who I really am and loving all of it, the money and the mission, the fears and the dreams, the woman I was and the woman I'm still becoming." The reception was held in the museum's garden court, with tables scattered among sculptures and fountains, string lights creating a canopy of stars above the celebration. Margaret Chen gave a toast that brought tears to my eyes, talking about watching me grow from an uncertain young woman hiding behind a facade into someone who'd found her authentic voice. Samuel was there, having closed Meridian Books for the afternoon to attend. At 81, he'd become something of a legend in literary circles, known for his ability to discover treasures that others overlooked. He'd agreed to sell me the bookstore the previous year, not because he needed the money, but because he trusted me to preserve its mission while expanding its reach.
It now served as the Foundation's flagship community outreach center, offering programming that ranged from children's story hours to graduate-level seminars on manuscript preservation. To Elena and Michael, Samuel raised his glass during the toasts, his voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. May your love story be as enduring as the literature you both cherish, and may your partnership create new chapters that inspire future generations. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift away, Michael and I found ourselves alone in the garden, surrounded by the remnants of celebration and the promise of tomorrow. The Foundation had grown beyond my wildest dreams, with satellite offices in 6 cities and partnerships that spanned 3 continents. We were preserving manuscripts, funding translations, creating educational programs, and building digital libraries that made literature accessible to anyone with an internet connection. No regrets? Michael asked, taking my hand as we walked among the roses. I thought about the question seriously. Did I regret the years of hiding my wealth, the relationship with Marcus that had ended in mutual disappointment, the complicated journey that had brought me to this moment?
No regrets, I said finally. Everything that happened, the good and the bad, the mistakes and the discoveries, led me here, to this work, to you, to understanding who I'm supposed to be. And who is that? I smiled, feeling the weight and freedom of complete honesty. Elena Vasquez, storyteller and storykeeper, someone who believes that literature can change the world one reader at a time. 5 years later. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing grant applications in my office. David, who'd been promoted to program director, knocked on my door with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Elena, you need to take this call. It's Stockholm." My heart stopped for a moment before understanding flooded in. The Nobel Committee. They were calling to inform me that Dr. Michael Rodriguez had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his groundbreaking work in translation theory and cross-cultural literary studies, work that had been largely funded and supported by the Foundation. I picked up the phone with trembling hands, listening as the committee chair explained that Michael's contributions to making world literature accessible across language barriers had transformed the field. His translations of indigenous poetry from the Americas had brought voices to global attention that might otherwise have remained unheard, while his theoretical work had revolutionized how scholars thought about the relationship between language and meaning. "Mrs. Rodriguez," the chair said, "we understand that the Vasquez Literary Foundation has been instrumental in supporting Dr. Rodriguez's research. We wanted to acknowledge the important role philanthropy plays in advancing literary scholarship." After the call ended, I sat in my office for a long moment, overwhelmed by pride and gratitude. Michael's work had always been brilliant, but seeing it recognized on this scale felt like validation not just of his genius, but of the Foundation's mission. We'd proven that strategic philanthropy could amplify academic excellence and bring important voices to global audiences. The phone rang again. This time it was Michael himself, calling from Colombia, where he'd just received the news. "Elena." His voice was thick with emotion. "I can't believe this is real." "Believe it," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You've earned this. Your work has changed how people think about literature, about translation, about the power of crossing cultural boundaries through story." "I couldn't have done any of it without you, without the Foundation. You gave me the freedom to pursue research that other institutions thought was too risky, too unconventional. You gave me the opportunity to use my resources for something that truly matters. We make a good team." The Nobel announcement dominated the news cycle for days, with profiles of Michael that inevitably mentioned the Foundation's role in supporting his work.
The foundation's phone rang constantly with interview requests, funding proposals, and congratulations from literary organizations around the world. But the moment that mattered most came 3 days later, when I was going through my grandmother's papers, documents I'd been slowly organizing for a memoir I was writing about her life. Tucked inside a folder of investment records, I found a letter I'd never seen before, dated just a month before her death. Mi querida Elena, if you are reading this, it means you have found your purpose. I have watched you struggle with the burden of wealth, wondering how to use it wisely, how to honor those who came before while creating something new. Know that every choice you make, every program you fund, every life you touch through literature is a fulfillment of dreams I could never have imagined for myself. You have taken the tools I left you and built something beautiful. You have become the woman I always knew you could be. Con amor eterno, Abuela Isabela.
I sat in my office, holding the letter as afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, and finally understood that my journey hadn't been about learning to manage wealth or navigating social expectations or even finding love. It had been about discovering that the most powerful stories are the ones we write with our lives, the legacies we create through our choices, the ways we use whatever resources we have, financial, intellectual, emotional, to make the world a little more literate, a little more connected, a little more just. The foundation now operated in 12 countries, had digitally preserved over 10,000 rare manuscripts, funded translations of literature from 46 languages, and created educational programs that had reached more than 1 million students. Michael's Nobel Prize was just the latest validation of work that had become bigger than either of us individually, a testament to what was possible when resources met passion and purpose. That evening, as I walked home through the city streets I'd come to know so well, I thought about the girl who'd once hidden her wealth behind a bookstore counter, terrified that money would define her relationships and limit her authentic connections. That girl had been wise to be cautious, but wrong to believe that hiding was the answer. The truth was simpler and more complex than she'd understood. Wealth was indeed a tool, but like any tool, its value lay not in possessing it, but in using it skillfully, purposefully, in service of something greater than oneself. My grandmother had left me more than money. She'd left me the opportunity to discover who I really was when I stopped being afraid of what I had and started focusing on what I could do. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, where Michael would be waiting with champagne and stories about his day of interviews and congratulations, I carried with me the satisfaction of a life lived authentically. The whispers about marrying above my station had long since faded, replaced by recognition of work that spoke for itself. I was no longer the girl they'd underestimated, the bookstore clerk who'd surprised them all. I was Elena Vasquez Rodriguez, philanthropist and advocate, someone who'd learned that the most important inheritances aren't financial but philosophical, the values and vision that transform resources into legacy, money into meaning, and individual success into collective advancement. And in the end, that was a story worth telling. Subscribe to Scarred by Secrets, where silence is never forgotten.